Okay, hello. I hope you're all very well, as we are now in week 9 of this slightly truncated, slightly shorter teaching semester, slightly shorter and slightly stranger teaching semester. We're getting towards the end of our story on Eastern and Central Europe. As I say, we only have 11 weeks of teaching this semester, and in terms of the chronology, in terms of the time that we're covering, we're getting quite close to the end. We're talking today about the 1980s in Poland and in Bulgaria. Next week we'll talk about the revolutionary years of 1989. The so-called miraculous year during which the regimes throughout the bloc collapsed. And then the final week, we'll talk a little bit about the Balkans. We'll talk about Yugoslavia. We'll talk about the breakup of that country. And we'll talk about the terrible wars that accompanied, very unfortunately accompanied that breakup. And I hope by now that things are starting to become a little clearer in terms of the material that we're covering. And I know that at the beginning of the semester, this was all, of course, very new, and a lot of new geography, a lot of new names, a lot of new places. What I've tried to do, and what I hope I have succeeded in doing, you of course will be the judges of that, is to try to build up this story, to try to sort of keep referencing, keep culminating information that we've covered already, and try to build up a coherent and an integrated picture of the regime of the history. Of course, all of these things are online, aren't they? I mean, all of the lectures are recorded and accessible throughout the semester. So if there is anything that is not clear, you can always go back to the point that you don't understand and rewatch. Because we have the readings as well, don't we? And Crampton and this kind of thing. Okay, so let's then look at the slideshow. We're talking then about Poland and the Solidarity crisis. So as I say, the 1980s. Now, before I begin, this is slide 1. You may well recognize he'll be one of the people that we're talking quite a lot about in today's lecture. That's Lech Walesa, electrician turned trades union leader in 1980s Poland. We'll be talking a lot about this man later on in this module. But before we begin, more generally, I want to talk a little bit about what the 1980s were like. Try to generalize a little bit about that. This period is known as late socialism, and that's the name for this period of the socialist countries, not just in Central and Eastern Europe, so not just in the area that we're covering, but also in the Soviet Union as well. So what does this concept of late socialism mean? What it means is that the societies, the regimes that we've been studying have transformed quite dramatically since they came into power, as we saw all those weeks ago, at the end of the Second World War. The way these regimes function and the way these regimes operate has become very different from the way they operated at the beginning. So, for example, when the regimes came into power at the end of the Second World War, we saw that there was violence, didn't we? We saw that there was oppression. We saw that there were non-judicial killings. There were trials, show trials. There was something like sort of state terror and police terror. In certain parts of the bloc, particularly when Stalin was alive up until 1953. But there was also a sense of propulsion, there was a sense of dynamism. There was a sense that a new political ideology had come into power, that it had a vision for the future, that it was very activist, that it was building new buildings, new factories. It was trying to sort of achieve a revolution in gender relations, in relations between men and women, and education and the workplace, and the family. And we'd looked at places like Albania, which had been extremely traditional and, dare I say, backward before the end of the Second World War. And for all of Enver Hoxha's many faults, and there were many of them, I don't doubt that for a moment. He nevertheless, his regime did attempt to sort of modernize and end things like the blood vendetta and the blood feud, and try to sort of transform these societies. Now, late socialism was not like that. It has a very different way of operating. Many people feel that the Prague Spring was a great turning point. Whenever we talked about that last week, and I talked about how once the Soviet Union, once the Soviet forces arrived and occupied the country, there was an attempt to sort of create this so-called regime of normalization, to sort of distill, to temper down, to quieten down the political ferment, to get people off the streets, to create a sort of simple, level of consumption and consumerism and leisure, and hopefully in that way sort of depoliticize the society, to depoliticize the state and the people. And I sort of said that, in the 70s and the 80s in Czechoslovakia, not everyone, but in most cases, for most parts of society, there was no longer this conviction that communism could deliver on its promises, that it could create, a better world, that it could create that its emancipatory promises, which many people had believed right up until the 1960s, were no longer convincing. And we'd used this discussion about Havel, and we talked about his essay, The Power of the Powerless. And I'd said this kind of, this is a sort of symbol of life in normalized Czechoslovakia, that the greengrocer puts up the Marxist slogans in his shop, not because he believes in them, but for all kinds of sort of other reasons, that he wants a quiet life, that he wants to be left alone by the regime, and these sorts of things. And then Havel kind of suggested, didn't he, that that this was being duplicated many millions of times across the entire state, and from the level of the lowly greengrocer right up to, say, the first the general secretary of the Communist Party at that time in Czechoslovakia, was a man called Gustav Husak, who was a Slovak. And so this notion of normalization, this notion of sort of being no longer believing in the promises, and no longer believing in what socialism could deliver, was kind of the story elsewhere as well. And that's sort of what people think of when they think of late socialism. No longer sort of the revolutionary promises, the notions of emancipation and the notions of improving people's lives. Most parts of society no longer believe in those, even though they may espouse them and they may mouth them at party meetings and on May Day and in the parades and this kind of thing. The reality is that people didn't sort of, no longer had the conviction that such things were going to change society, such things were going to make society better. I quite like this image. This is taken from Poland in the early 80s, which was briefly under martial law, but in other ways is a relatively miserable place for many people in the 1980s. It's quite a nice photo essay by, I think, a British photographer. I've included the link there. Not all the pictures are sort of miserable images of people queuing and feeling extremely sort of pissed off on public transport. There's some lovely images of weddings and of feasts and parties and this kind of thing. And I hope that kind of gives you a sense of what life, gives you a little glimpse of what life was like in the socialist bloc in the 1980s. But the bottom line is that for many people, for most parts of society throughout the bloc, there was no longer the belief that socialism was functioning properly. People were going along with it because they wanted the quiet life. They wanted, the better life for their family. They wanted a new car. They wanted a larger apartment. They wanted some sort of job promotion. Things like reading the newspaper, very, very, very often the memoirs of the socialist period. We'll talk about sort of watching the television news or reading the newspaper, listening to the radio. And it would be like listening to sort of non-news. It would just be more stories about how the 5-year plan was being exceeded, about how a new factory was opening up in Bucharest or, in some part of Hungary. There would be some story about, the achievements of the socialist, the socialist state. they might have been convincing in the 50s or even in the 60s, when people could demonstrably see that things were changing, that new things were being built, that things were sort of, that society and the state was transforming. But in the 1980s, this was much harder. People were not convinced. Because people could see actually that this system was crumbling. So all of this will give you maybe, I hope, I'm not trying to say that it was doomed to fail, or that its failure, when it end, when it comes next month, when we talk about that next week, that its end was inevitable, because certainly it wasn't. And many people were very surprised in 1989 when the regimes did indeed collapse. But nevertheless, you kind of get a sense that these regimes are not quite as not quite as functional and not quite as successful as they may make out. Okay, so let's talk about Poland now. Before I begin properly, after 10 minutes, here's a historian who's originally from Wales, a guy called Norman Davies, who has written, that's in slide number 3. Has written very well and very eloquently and very voluminously on various parts of Polish history. He's a very good writer, and he has some very good general studies of Poland in the modern period, but even going back further than that. So if anybody's interested in Poland, particularly for the final project, or just generally interested in finding out more about Poland, the work of Norman Davies comes highly recommended. He's a very good introductory guide to all things Polish, and his little book, The Heart of Poland, which is a small history of Poland, is a very very good sort of introductory text to things that are happening in Poland. Okay, so what do we know about Poland? Let's have a quick recap. Slide number 4. We remember that during there was an interwar state. It was invaded and occupied by both the Nazis and the Soviet Union in 1939, according to the secret protocols of the so-called Non-Aggression Pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, between the Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. So during the Second World War, the independent Polish state was carved up between two totalitarian regimes. The eastern parts were taken and were annexed by the Soviet Union, and the western parts were occupied and also annexed, although that annexation would turn out to be temporary, by Nazi Germany. Now, of course, as well, tragically, in slide number 5, the Holocaust, much of the Holocaust happened on Polish territory, which is to say that the death camps, almost all of them, were situated on Polish soil. They were not ran by Poles. They had nothing to do with Poles, other than that many Poles were sort of, were victims, were inmates of these camps. They were, of course, run entirely and exclusively by Nazi Germany. But nevertheless, these camps were on Polish territory, and many Poles and many Polish Jews, almost all of them, in fact, and they had played a very important role and a very important part in Polish society and Polish history before that. Met their ends during the Second World War. Now, there was also the Katyn Forest Massacre. We've spoken a little bit about this, taking place between April and May 1940. And the Katyn Woods Massacre was the Soviet Union seeing that when they came into Poland in 1939. When they occupied and annexed Polish territories, they could see that there would be, or they anticipated that there would be resistance to this annexation, and they knew particularly that there would be the Polish army, particularly its officer corps, was highly politicized, highly nationalized, and could form a bastion of resistance to this attempted occupation of the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union's response to this, Stalin's response to this, was extremely ruthless. That was to round up between 20 to 25,000 Polish officers, and also cultural leaders like priests, teachers, a smaller number of such people, incarcerate them and then systematically to execute all of them. This was the NKVD, the secret security police, the predecessors of what would later become the KGB. And what is arguably today still in existence, the FSB, the security forces of Putin's Russia. So between 20 and 25,000 people were Poles, mainly Polish army officers, as I say, were murdered between April and May 1940. Now, there was insult included in this injury. The Soviet Union, of course, never acknowledged this crime. It was discovered by the Nazis when they captured those territories from the Soviets, I think in 1943. They attempted to make a big propaganda coup out of this, but when the war was over, Stalin blamed the Nazis on the Katyn Woods massacre. Never acknowledged Soviet guilt, and in fact, it was never acknowledged right up until Perestroika, so right up until the end of the 1980s. Despite the fact that many Poles, including the families of the men who had been killed, knew full well what had happened. They knew that it just didn't it didn't make sense that the dates were being lied about, and then they claimed that it took place during the German occupation, when of course it didn't. It took place during the Soviet occupation. So that was the Second World War, a very difficult period for the Poles. In slide number 7, you can see the remains of Warsaw. There was also, of course, an uprising. We talked about that in 1944 from the Polish Home Army, which was put down by the Nazis. But the Soviets, of course, the Red Army had already arrived in Poland, in Warsaw. They were on the other bank of the river, at the edge of Warsaw, the Vistula River. And they, of course, refused to cross the river and to give any sort of aid or give any assistance to the uprising, preferring to sort of let it rage itself out, and then simply walk in and grab what had become a low-hanging fruit. Okay, so at the end of 1945, Poland. Famously, the borders of Poland transformed quite radically. I think we also spoke briefly about this. The eastern territories of Poland were annexed by the Soviet Union, and the western territories, which had been Prussia, had been part of Germany, were given in exchange to Poland. You can kind of see it in this map in slide number 8. The way Polish borders transformed, and essentially the Polish state shifted westwards because of the result of these border transformations. Many Poles who lived in the eastern territories, those territories that had been annexed, were now being annexed at the end of the Second World War to the Soviet Union, were forced to sort of leave their homes and move into these territories that were being given to the Poles in the west of the country. So it was a very dramatic time as well. Now, what this meant was, for various reasons, the Poland that emerged at the end of the Second World War, even before the communists took power, was very different from the Poland that had been formed at the end of the First World War. And that was not just because the borders had changed. The eastern territories had been annexed by the Soviet Union. The western territories, what had once been Prussian Germany, German Prussia, were given to Poland. But it was also because of the Holocaust, because of the expulsion of the Germans, and because of losing territories in the east, where there had been very large numbers of, for example, Ukrainians. The Poland that emerged at the end of the Second World War was much more nationally homogeneous than the one that had been around in the interwar period. In the interwar period, I think I mentioned that about 67% of the population was Polish, and the remaining 30+% were Germans, Jewish, Ukrainians. so-called Rusins, so various other sort of nationalities. This was very different at the end of the Second World War. Almost, I think it was 99%, 98 or 99% of the Polish population were Polish. So the state was much more nationally homogenous. Now, this, of course, created new attitudes and new moods. The sort of the sense of national identity was much more cohesive and coherent at the end of the Second World War. In the interwar period, ideas about the Polish national state had to be quite latitudinarian. They had to kind of include, they had to encompass sort of people who weren't, Germans and Ukrainians and, in the Jewish population. They, had to be much more sort of broad-based. At the end of the Second World War, this was really Poland for the Poles. And so Polish national identity was much more straightforward and dare I say, much more vehement. And that, of course, would become a problem for the Communist Party going forwards. The other thing is that the Polish Catholic Church, which had always been an important force within Polish society, would become much more potent now. Despite the pressures of the communists, despite the sort of, the campaign waged against the Catholic Church as an institution and against religion in general, nevertheless, the Catholic Church emerged as a much more stronger sort of institutional and social force and cultural force within Poland, and to a great extent, even in the 21st century, for reasons that I'll try to explain later, the Polish Catholic Church still is very, very powerful. Okay, now for all of these reasons, in slide number 9, making Poland communist was always a very difficult thing to achieve. Like Stalin famously said that turning the Polish state into a communist state was a bit like fitting a saddle on a cow. I don't really know what he meant, I have to say, and that's very often the case with Stalin. I don't really understand what he's trying to say, and I don't know if he understood either. Whether he's saying that this was a difficult thing to do, I never tried to do it, I must admit. Maybe he was trying to say that the saddle, doesn't fit a cow because it should fit a horse. I suppose another way of looking at it would be to say that it's a completely pointless thing to do, because you don't need to put a saddle on a cow. So there are all many different sort of interpretations of Stalin's epigram, of Stalin's aphorism. But essentially the notion here is that communism was a very difficult fit for the Polish state. That there was not a big communist movement before the war. Communism was associated with the Soviet Union, which was associated in many Polish eyes with Russia. Russia was deeply unpopular because of the imperial experience of many Poles, then because of the occupation of the Soviet Union, then because of Katyn, then because of the Warsaw Uprising. It was a very awkward fit. It was a very ill fit. Now, we'd seen, hadn't we, in slide number 10, the matters came to a head in 1956 in Poznan. There had been a workers' uprising, and just about the Polish security forces and the Polish Communist Party were able to regain control of the matter. But it was a very close run thing, and Khrushchev, of course, visited Poland just before the just as these problems were about to happen, and there's every indication, or there are many indications, that if the Polish this uprising had become more widespread, if there had been larger problems, then Khrushchev would have been willing to do what he eventually did do in Hungary later that year, which is to say invade and forcibly reimpose the Polish state. Okay, now let's shift forward. We've covered all of that more or less, haven't we, in previous lectures? But what we haven't covered is kind of what happened after that. In the wake of 1956, a figure called Władysław Gomułka, that's in slide number 11, was reinstated or was instated as the first secretary of the Polish United Workers' Party, so the Polish, the general secretary, the leader of communist Poland. And there's a picture of Władysław Gomułka right there. Now, Gomułka was a communist, but he was more popular than his predecessors, and he was more acceptable to many people in Poland. He had been removed from his positions and from his posts in 1948 during the era of the Titoist purges. He had been accused also of possible sort of nationalist deviances, of straying from the orthodox Stalinist position. He had not lost his life. He had not been put on trial, but he had been removed from office. So relatively speaking, he got off lightly. He was reinstated in 1956, and this was seen as a concession by everybody to Polish national sentiment. And he took this position and he held up this office from 1956 up until 1970. Now, under Gomułka, things improved slightly. In the wake of the uprising, in the wake of the unrest of 1956, in the wake of what many people had thought had been a near miss with possible Soviet intervention, Gomułka was Gomułka was able to create a better sort of social contract. For example, certain relaxation of certain areas, concessions and amnesties for people who had fought in the Home Army, less pressure on the Polish Catholic Church, some of the consumption and consumerist and leisure things that we discussed a few lectures ago. So the so-called People's Poland was not by no means was it a paradise. A workers' paradise in the 1960s under Gomułka, but it was better than it had been in the 1950s, and Gomułka was somebody who was sort of more acceptable to many people in Poland. Now, jumping forward, the next interesting and important thing that happened in Poland was the so-called Polish March of 1968. Now, we talked a little bit already, hadn't we, in last week's session, how 1968 was a very dramatic year in Czechoslovakia. It was the culmination of this sort of reform communist movement, this very exciting period in the arts and the culture, a very exciting period, it seemed, politically under Alexander Dubček, the first secretary of the Communist Party, but one that ended very abruptly with Soviet intervention in August 1968. Now, it was also a dramatic year. It's one of those revolutionary years, and it was also a dramatic year elsewhere in the bloc. So, for example, in Yugoslavia, there had been student protests against the regime and against various things. So it also seemed to be quite an exciting and quite an interesting year there as well. And of course, as many of you will know, 1968 in places like France, Paris, in Berkeley, in California, in West Germany, in Italy, throughout the world, or throughout the Western world at least. This was a moment of sort of transformation, a new generation of people, of young people coming of age, challenging the political orthodoxies of the time, challenging the ideas that had held sway. So 1968 was a transformative year in many cases. Now, it was also in Poland, but for slightly different reasons. There's a couple of things that sort of happened that kind of spurred, a sort of interesting moment in Poland. The first was a theatre production of a very famous dramatic poem by one of the great 19th century romantic nationalist poets, a poet called Adam Mickiewicz. And Mickiewicz wrote a poem called Gwiazdy, which in English is translated as Forefathers' Eve. And it's a long and complicated poem, which I have read, honestly, and it goes on and on. But this particular production, which was put on in 1967, I think at the end of 1967, was quite daring insofar as it played up anti-Russian notions and anti-Russian themes. The poem has it's about a revolutionary hero from the 18th, a revolutionary Polish hero from the 18th century who fights against the Russians. So it is intrinsically anti-Russian, but those anti-Russian elements were exaggerated, or they were put to the forefront in this play. Now, theatre plays can, as many of you will know from Irish history, from things like The Plough and the Stars and Sean Casey, you will know that people get very agitated and very excited at theatre productions, and it's a chance to enact sort of nationalist ideas and nationalist themes. So a lot of people went to see this play. It was the talk of the town. It was played in Warsaw, and it created a sensation. People were coming out and were kind of so fired up by the lessons, the sort of anti-Russian lessons that they were taking from this theatre performance, that they really kind of came out onto the streets and they were protesting, and it seemed to be potentially a moment of revolution. Now, the Polish Communist Party, a little bit panicked by this, and authoritarian regimes usually are panicked when people come out onto the streets. You saw that 10 years ago in the Arab Spring. In societies where rule depends upon an authoritarian political force imposing its will on the society, and the society obediently following it. Even small acts of protest become potentially problematic because they could lead to something much bigger. So the regime was panicked, and rather cynically, they kind of conflated what was happening. This is in 1968. That there had been the Arab-Israeli War the year before. In 1967, and Israel was now the sort of the big enemy of the communist bloc. The Soviet Union and the satellite states had they saw in Israel a U.S. satellite state, a state which was very closely aligned to the USA. They put their support behind the Arab, some national liberation movements like the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, the Ba'athist Party in Syria and in Iraq. Those forces of decolonization. Those were the sort of that was the side, if you like, that the communist bloc was on. So there was kind of a conflation once again, as there had been at the end of the Second World War. The communist regime blamed this unrest on so-called Zionists, which they meant, it sort of meant, strictly speaking, Jewish nationalists. So people who might be supporting Israel, in Poland, supporting Israel against their own country, against the Arabs. But essentially it's what we would call today a dog whistle, an anti-Semitic dog whistle, and an opportunity for the party to once again purge Jewish members. So from 68 to 69, in the wake of this sort of small unrest created by the performance of Mickiewicz's play, entangled with this kind of paranoia on the part of the Polish state about the loyalty of its Jewish population, that there was a party purge. It got quite nasty, the rhetoric, the way Jews were spoken about, the Jewish population of Poland, what remained of it. Of course, it was only a fragment after the Holocaust. Was seriously sort of was persecuted. From 68 to 69, about 15,000 Polish Jews departed and left this country. And the regime was quite happy to let them go, believing that they were not reliable. So many of them many of them went to Israel. Some went to the USA. The great social scientist, the great political scientist Jan Gross, who would later write great books about Polish anti-Semitism since the end of the Second World War, a topic, of course, which he knew extremely well, was one of those people who eventually went on to work at Princeton University in the United States. Okay, so let's now skip forward to the end of the 1970s, the beginning of the 1980s, and talk about the transformations that took place then. I would foreground all of this by saying in slide number 13, for this period that I'm now going to talk about, which will be the last thing that I mention in this lecture, there's a very good first-hand account. It's by a writer called Kazimierz Brandis. He wrote a book called A Warsaw Diary, which was essentially a diary about his life in Warsaw. So that it does exactly what it says on the tin. Between 1978 and 1981. He talks about the atmosphere of the times. He talks about the transformations that are happening, which I'll now explain. He talks about the memories of the Second World War. He talks about the memories of the of the theatre performance and the anti-Semitic campaign of 1968 and 1969, and it's a very good sort of account it's a very good first-hand account of life under communism. It's quite similar to Vatsulik's book, A Czech Dream Book, which I talked about last week, it is actually quite interesting to compare those two. As first-hand accounts of life under communism. It must be said, of course, both of them are written by intellectuals who are essentially anti-communist, which is not that doesn't make them necessarily representative of the entire society, but they are nevertheless very they have a lot of insights about what is happening. Okay, let's go to slide number 14. In 1978, a man called Karol Wojtyla, who had been the Archbishop of Krakow, and then became a cardinal in the Vatican in Rome, was elected the Pope. And of course, we all know him as my namesake, John Paul II. Elected as Pope in 1978, and of course we all know how important he was in Ireland, for example, throughout the Catholic world, but particularly in Poland. John Paul II, this was the first time ever, the first time in history that there had been a Polish Pope. It was a huge moment of pride for many people in Poland. As I mentioned earlier, the Polish Catholic Church had emerged as a very sort of potent and powerful force within Polish society, and there were very many people who were sort of very hopeful about the election of John Paul II. Now, Karol Wojtyla was, of course, also very anti-communist. As a Catholic, he would be, wouldn't he? Because the communists were atheists. The communists were, in a sense, opposed to the Catholic Church. So for Karol Wojtyla, for John Paul II, the anti-communism in a sense came naturally. But as he sort of became, as he was Pope and he started to, he started to make his mark in the 1980s, as all popes do, this sort of anti-communism became a very important plank of his public speaking and his public, his public performances and his public masses, and this kind of thing. He was very much a man of the times. That the 1980s in the West, it's the era of Margaret Thatcher and of Ronald Reagan. It's the era of those sort of great cold warriors, those people who were very assertive and very vocal in their opposition to communism. And Pope John Paul II was of that was of that ilk. He was a man who also had very very strong opinions on communism. Now, he visited Poland, gave masses in Poland several times. The first one was in 1979, and he did throughout the 1980s. Now, some of you will know, because you will remember, that you will know the great story of John Paul II giving a mass in Phoenix Park in Ireland in whenever it was 1979, and about half the country, for God's sakes, piled into Phoenix Park to see this, and it was a great sort of moment of importance, and it just showed how sort of popular and important the Catholic Church was in Catholic Ireland at the end of the 1970s, and some people have remarked that when the Pope visited lately, more recently, there was virtually, it was only a fraction of the crowd there. But anyway, in 1978 or whenever it was, when John Paul II gave mass in Phoenix Park, it was a huge thing. Now, it was even bigger. Would you believe, in Poland? The popularity of this Pope. The affection that the Poles felt for him, the love they felt for him, and the national pride that many felt, many Catholic Poles that felt that they now had this Pope, was very sort of, it's very important. So it's a turning point, and a very important one for Poland. You now have this very assertive anti-communist Pope, Polish Pope, who is visiting Poland very often, and is speaking very critically about the human rights abuses, about the persecution of the church within Poland. So it's a wedge, a very powerful wedge, potentially, against the Polish Communist Party, and one that they have to take very seriously. Now, the other thing is happening in the factories, and it's happening amongst the workers, and it requires a little bit of background to understand this story. Poland had periodically, we talked already about 1956 and the workers' unrest. After that moment, Poland had periodically witnessed sort of sporadic wildcat strikes within the country. So workers downing tools, workers demanding pay rises, workers demanding these sorts of things. One of the most important ones took place in 1970 at the big shipyards, the Lenin shipyards on the Baltic Sea in the north of the country, in Gdansk and Gdynia. Those were huge, massive shipbuilding plants where ships for the warships for the Soviet Navy, and these sorts of things, aircraft carriers later on were built. So it's a huge sort of colossus of communist industry, and a lot of Poles were of course employed there. Now, occasionally there were strikes, and there were problems, because striking was illegal under the communist regime. And one of the most dramatic ones took place in 1970. When workers came out onto the streets once again, the communist secret police and the security services panicked. They began to fire they began to fire upon workers. Several people were killed. And this created a terrible sort of, they created terrible scenes. This is 1917, and people had very keen and very vivid memories of this moment. Okay, now that's background to the dramatic changes that took place at the end of the 1970s and at the beginning of the 1980s. Once again, there were strikes in the Polish in the Gdansk shipworks, in the Lenin shipworks. Once again, the workers came out onto the streets, but this time they wanted to kind of keep the momentum of this movement and this moment going. They wanted to sort of keep this moving forward. And what they wanted to do was quite a controversial thing. The leaders of this strike movement sort of felt that they looked back, to 1970. They looked back to the violence that had been inflicted upon them. They looked back to other strikes in the 70s. They thought about their poor wages. They thought about their poor conditions. And they decided that it was time to organize, that they needed some kind of trade union that could protect their rights from their employers. Now, it's a very controversial and a very strange departure in communist history, and I hope you'll understand why this is so strange. The Polish state, the communist state, like any state, is claims to be a workers' state. It claims to be a state which has been, which the Communist Party runs in the interests of the working classes, not the exploiting classes. But now in Gdansk and throughout the country, you have this movement, this groundswell of labor organization, of labor unionization, which is essentially saying the workers now need to come together. They need to form a union which can protect their rights against their employer, and their employer happens to be the Communist Party of Poland, of People's Poland. It's a departure that has not happened anywhere else in the bloc. There are unions, of course, but all of these are subordinated to the Communist Party itself. They are Communist Party unions, and there were Communist Party unions, of course, in Poland too. But what was happening here was the formation of an independent trade union movement. It would become known as Solidarity. If we quickly flip forward to slide number 17, you can see an image of their iconic logo, which is simply seen everywhere, was seen everywhere in the 1970s and the 1980s. Solidarność, which is in Polish, of course, for solidarity, the trades union movement. Now, this as a sort of bastion, as a challenge to the communist regime, was qualitatively different, in my opinion. But I think in general, people would agree with me. They should. That this was a qualitatively different thing from the anti-communist movements we've seen elsewhere. The reform movement in 1956, Charter 77 that we spoke about last week, in Czechoslovakia. And it's different because this is not just a small group of intellectuals like Havel and his theatre pals. There were those sorts of groups. There were charter-like groups of intellectuals and academics within Poland. There were those things too. But what we're talking about here is a mass movement of workers, a mass movement of the working class, which is organizing itself against the communist movement. Now, this is a very delicate and sort of fragile dance, if you like, that Solidarity and the leaders of the movement are doing with the communist regime. They want to protect their interests. They want to protect those of the workers. They want to rule out, they want to be able to negotiate pay. They want to negotiate working hours and working conditions like any union does. They wanted to protect themselves from violence and from exploitation, which they felt they were periodically being subjected to in their places of work. But at the same time, they knew that if they pushed the boat too far, they could really endanger themselves. If they were too confrontational with the Communist Party, there could be some terrible repercussions. The movement could be rounded up. Its leaders could be imprisoned, as sometimes they were. The worst case scenario for everyone involved, including the Polish Communist Party, was that Solidarity would get out of control completely, that it would become a political movement, that it would challenge the hegemony of the Polish Communist Party, and that this would be the beginning of that this would be an excuse that the Soviet Union needed, for example, to sort of invade to invade the country. So it was a very delicate game, and in a sense, it's not exactly that this was always a battle between the Communist Party, between the Polish Communist Party and Solidarity. There were moments of negotiation as well. There were moments where the Polish Communist Party said, look, okay, we're willing to make concessions and we're willing to make certain recognitions, and maybe your legality is something that we can acknowledge and we can discuss, and indeed that ultimately was the big breakthrough for Poland, for Solidarity. But both sides are sort of thinking to themselves, look, we want to sort of reach an agreement which is acceptable for everyone, but at the same time doesn't sort of end up getting out of control, and creating a reason, for example, for the Soviet Union to get involved. Okay, now on slide number 18, we'll meet the leading figure of Solidarity, an electrician from Gdansk called Lech Walesa, who is still alive and is still considered by many, including me, to be a considerably impressive figure. Lech Walesa was very unlike Havel. He was a rough and ready guy, essentially self-educated, not some theatre impresario or some theatre playwright or some philosophical intellectual, but a regular working class guy, liked the drink, liked the vodka, was devoted to sort of Catholicism and to his family, but was also somebody who was a champion of workers' rights, so he became he worked in the Gdansk shipyards. And he became one of the key figures of the Solidarity Trades Union movement. Now, I haven't met Walesa, but last year in San Francisco, at an academic conference, he attended, and I went to see him talk. And Walesa is a very, he's still, he's. Do I want to explain this? Okay, I do. It'll take me a bit longer, but nevertheless, I'm going to explain this. Solidarity would go on to become a political... Ultimately, we'll see next week, they would go on to become a political party, fully fledged. And Walesa would become a president of post-communist Poland in the 1990s. But there are various wings of the Solidarity movement, various approaches, because it was a mass movement. There were various factions and various ideas. And Walesa was of the faction within Solidarity who believed that it was necessary to negotiate with the communists, to talk to them, to try to reach an accommodation with them. There was a more radical faction, a more right-wing faction, which refused to discuss anything with the Communist Party, was much more confrontational, and didn't have any dealings. Now, if we fast forward to 21st century Poland, those various factions of Solidarity have become the different political parties, the different political groups within contemporary Poland. And at the moment, the nationalist conservative government of the Law and Justice Party, in part, are the right wing of Solidarity, the anti-Walesa regime. And they have been using the fact that he went and met with communist officials to attempt to sort of tarnish his reputation and tarnish his name in contemporary Poland. So Walesa is still very much politically active, and he's very much opposed to the direction that Poland is taking at the moment, which is to say going down this very conservative, very nationalistic, very right-wing path. And some of you maybe will know the details of that. The details of that story. When Solidarity became legal, there was a ceremony, and very famously, Walesa sat down with the Communist Party and signed the documents which would bring the Solidarity trade union into legal existence. And he used this huge, ridiculous pen, which unfortunately, I mean, you can Google it, you can find it quite easily, but it was this massive kind of comic pen which had the colors of the Polish flag. And at this conference that I went to at San Francisco, where Lech Walesa spoke, about halfway through, he pulled it out. He had it on him, this pen, still after 40 years. And he sort of brandished and waved it around, and of course all of us, many people in the audience were very sort of impressed and very pleased. Now, as a historian, it's wrong to idolize and to sort of to hold these people up as sort of, you have to be critical about them, and you have to just sort of understand them in their own terms, and you mustn't sort of swoon to them, and that's true of any political figure. But there was a woman who I guess would have been a little bit younger than me, a Polish woman, who stood up and said, there was a Q&A at the end of this discussion, and she said, "Look, I just want to thank you for what you've done to us, what you've done for us." I grew up in the 90s, Poland. I was a young girl in the 80s. Of course, we had a picture of you in my house and a poster of Solidarity. I went on to become a graduate student. I traveled to the US. I did my PhD in wherever at an American university. And as far as I'm concerned, I would not have had this life's trajectory and these opportunities were it not, for people like you challenging the communist regime, challenging that, and kind of fighting in a sense for our freedom. I'll let you decide whether or not you think that's true, but certainly for this woman, she believed that to be the case. She looked upon Lech Walesa as somebody who had really sort of created, had really fought for the freedom to travel, freedom to study, freedom of speech, freedom to organize, all of these sorts of things. Okay. It did eventually get out of hand. Solidarity pushed a little bit too hard, or maybe the Polish Communist Party were worried about the direction that the Polish communists, that Solidarity were taking, and became worried perhaps that Solidarity would indeed begin to challenge the hegemony of the Polish Communist Party. In a sense, it's exactly what happened. The concerns of the Polish communists were identical to those of the Hungarian communists in 1956, and the Soviets, of course, and the Soviets and the Czechoslovak communists of 1968. Which is to say, it's okay to negotiate with these groups. It's okay to talk to them, to groups like the Reform movement in Czechoslovakia, or now in the 1980s, the beginning of the 1980s with Solidarity. But the moment the absolute authority, the political authority of the Communist Party is challenged, that is a red line, and once that's crossed, something has to be done about it. Now, Walesa was always attempting to rein in Solidarity. He talked about a self-limiting revolution, which is to say they did not aspire to political control. They did not aspire to challenge the Communist Party. They simply wanted greater rights for the workers. Now, that may or may not have been true in the eyes of Walesa, but there are certainly many people in Solidarity who felt differently. The right wing of Solidarity, for example, which, as I said, was far more confrontational with the Polish communists. And ultimately, in 1981, at the end of 1981, the Polish Communist Party decided that action needed to be taken to deal with what looked to be an emerging problem for the Polish Communist Party. Now, the man of the hour is in slide number 19, a rather unprepossessing gentleman, Wojciech Jaruzelski. Jaruzelski Jaruzelski was a communist leader, was a colonel, a general in the Polish army. He's wearing these glasses, because he was deported as a much younger man to the USSR. He was deported to Siberia. And he became, his eyesight became very damaged under the Siberian sun. It really will destroy your eyesight. It's unrestrained. It's beaming down on you. It's there like 18 hours a day, and it's reflecting up off the snow. I've only been to Siberia very briefly, but I could even see that this, if you glare at this long enough, you're going to have real trouble with your eyes. So Jaruzelski always wore these dark glasses, and it made him look every inch a sort of communist apparatchik, a communist functionary. Now, Jaruzelski was the head of VRON, the Committee of National Salvation. At the end of 1981, he decided that if the Polish communists did not do something to rein in solidarity, if they did not take control of the situation, it was highly likely that the Soviet Union would invade and would occupy Poland. And that, of course, was the worst case scenario, not just for solidarity, not just for the Polish Communist Party, but more generally for Polish society. So at the end of 1981, Jaruzelski went on television and announced martial law in Poland, which lasted, for a large part at the early 1980s. It's covered in Timothy Gardenash's book. That's in slide number 20, The Polish Revolution Solidarity. Timothy Gardenash was there in Gdansk, met Jaruzelski, met Lech Walesa, and gives an incredible sort of great first-hand account of everything that happened during that time. The edition that I put up there, I think was published in like 2001 or something like this. And Timothy Gardenash wrote a new preface, and in it he said that now it seems that the threat of Soviet invasion was not as likely as people believed, that probably the Soviets would not invade. They were getting bogged down in Afghanistan. They were worried about Reagan. They were worried about the new Cold War. It's possible they would not have invaded, and who knows? If Solidarity had kept pushing at that time, perhaps that would have been the beginning of the end for the communist regimes, and maybe it would have ended in the early 80s instead of in the late 80s, as it eventually did. But the simple fact is that for everyone involved, the likelihood of a Soviet Union, of a Soviet invasion was real enough. Okay, in slide number 21, one of my favorite pictures of the Cold War. This is a Moscow cinema, Kino Moskva, Moscow. So it's called Moscow Cinema, but it's in Warsaw, but it's called the Moscow Cinema. It's playing Francis Ford Coppola's Vietnam War movie, Apocalypse Now. And in front of it is an armored personnel vehicle. So this is under martial law. I think at the end of 1981, so like in December, around sort of Christmas time. It's by a British photographer, and it's just one of those moments that every element of the image just sort of accidentally coalesces, and you have this incredibly eloquent single frame expression of what's going on, the Moscow cinema, for God's sakes, the threat of Russia, the movie, Apocalypse Now, so the sense that the sense that the things are apocalyptic within the country, and then in front of it you have this military, armored personnel character, just to remind everyone that the country is under martial law. That's the story of essentially of how an independent trades union movement was formed, how and why an independent trade union movement was formed. And I apologize, I've gone well over time for this lecture, so I'll make it up by giving you a slightly shorter lecture in the second round. But I guess the takeaway from this lecture is the following one, that although Solidarity were banned under martial law, the mass organization, the nationwide organization of the movement did not go away. Walesa did not go away. In fact, he won the Nobel Peace Prize a few years later, and went out to Stockholm to collect it. No, so his wife did. He was under house arrest at the time. Or maybe even he was even in prison. I can't remember. We'll see next week when we talk about 1989 that the internal forces which would challenge ultimately successfully the communist regimes in the revolutionary year of 1989 began in Poland, and it really begins with this mass movement with solidarity, which, as I say, didn't go away, but were just sort of driven underground, but remained a potent political and social force. So thank you.